Today, on the 12th of August, we have further indications of deepening gloom in the West and recriminations concerning the failure, the now increasingly clear-cut failure of Ukraine's counterattack, a counteroffensive which has been underway since the 4th of June. Now, I previously discussed, as have other Russian officials, notably General Medvedev, or at least as have Russian officials, including General Medvedev, that for all practical purposes, it may be difficult for Ukraine to sustain this offensive beyond the end of August, given the shortages in ammunition. Now, I maintain that view, but obviously it's entirely speculative. I don't know either what Ukraine's military are planning or whether they have perhaps more stocks of ammunition than I know about, though as I think I've said in an earlier video, Russian reports now claim that 2/3 of the artillery shells launched by Ukraine are cluster munitions, which may also suggest that unitary munitions, the 155mm shells, are now running very short. Anyway, whatever, we're on the 12th of August. We are just weeks away now, about 3 weeks away now from that position when, according to my guesses and the guesses of some Russian officials, including General Medvedev, it will be extremely difficult to sustain this offensive for much longer. And I suspect that this is probably something that is increasingly understood by more and more people in the West, and it is probably why we see the mood shifting and why increasingly there are doubts about the offensive, not just the offensive, but the entire progress of the war starting to appear increasingly in the Western media. Anyway, I'm going to discuss this in a little more detail shortly, but first, just let's do a usual summary of the situation on the battlefronts. And as we will see, Ukraine is still very much at a standstill, but not just at a standstill. In some places, it's also now starting to lose ground, including in places where its offensive has been underway. Now, I'm going to take these reports, which I'm now going to read from Slavyangrad, Russian Telegram channel. Of course, many people will say that it's not reliable because it is Russian. I disagree. I have been tracking this war in detail now for more than a year and a half, ever since it started last February. And all I can say is that I've never seen Slavyangrad report things in high levels of detail and provide analysis which ultimately gave a false idea about the situation on the battlefronts. Sometimes they've made mistakes, but they've always corrected them very rapidly. Sometimes one could take issue with some of their analysis. But overall, if you want to get a good idea of what's actually going on, it seems to me that they are the single most steadily reliable source. Now, there are other good ones, but anyway, that is what I would say about Slavyangrad. The Russian Defense Ministry provides us every day with a daily bulletin, and it is sometimes quite interesting. But generally speaking, it confirms what Slavyangrad has already been saying, usually after an interval of about a day. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry also provides detailed reports. I'm going to say straight away that I find them less accurate and even more generalized in some respects than those that one gets from the Russians. And there are lots of other commentators and bloggers on the Russian side. There are a great many on the Ukrainian side. But overall, I still have to say I have found Slavyangrad the most reliable, at least of the English language sites that one can go to. And I'm going to give an example of something that happened yesterday, which gives us a further indication of why, as I said, Slavyangrad can perhaps be treated as more reliable than other sources. Yesterday, there were reports appearing on the Ukrainian side of the internet that the village of Sinkovka near Kupiansk, important village held by Ukraine. It's where the Ukrainians are trying to defend their positions. Just a few kilometers east of Kupiansk. If Sinkovka is captured by the Russians, then, as I said, the battle for Kupiansk is well and truly underway. Anyway, yesterday I saw that there were some reports from various Ukrainian sources which spoke of Sinkovka actually having been captured by the Russians. And that would have been very big news. I then checked it with other Russian sites. I checked it with Slavyangrad. And of course, there was no reference there to Sinkovka being captured. And in fact, as we'll see, a report that I'm going to be taking from Slavyangrad speaks of continued fighting in the area of Sinkovka. So it seems that this was one instance when Ukrainians, some people in Ukraine, were reporting bad news for their side, which hadn't actually happened. So anyway, I've said enough. I'm now going to go and read a report, frontline summary for the situation as of the morning of August 12th. Obviously, we're talking about the morning in the combat zone, which is several hours ahead of London. So this is now some hours in the past, as of the time of my making of this program. But anyway, this is what this particular report on Slavyangrad says, and we're told that it is being provided by somebody called Yevgeny Lizitsyn, who is described as some kind of a military commissar. I have no idea what that means. I suspect he's some kind of political official who is tracking what is happening in the war, or perhaps it's a name that a particular Russian reporter is giving himself. But whatever it is, Slavyangrad has vetted it, and what it says is consistent with everything else that I've seen about the situation on the battlefronts. And this is what this report says. In the Zaporozhye direction, the Ukrainian armed forces again made another attempt to storm Russian positions in the Rabotino area from Orekhov. I mentioned this, I think, yesterday, that there was yet another Ukrainian attack underway. And by the way, on that, there were some claims circulating in Ukraine that the Ukrainians had actually succeeded in entering Rabotino itself. And there was even a video, apparently, I've not seen it, briefly published, which appeared to show that. But anyway, this is what this report by Yevgeny Lizitsyn goes on to say. The Ukrainian troops came close to the Russian first line of defense, but the Russian armed forces, in the end, repelled all the attacks. The Ukrainians retreated, having suffered heavy losses in manpower and armored vehicles. According to available information, the armed forces of Ukraine lost at least 3 tanks and 6 armored vehicles. And I think this is correct. This is essentially what was being reported yesterday. by civilian officials, Russian civilian officials from the Zaporozhye regional government. There was an attack towards Rabotino from Orechov by Ukraine, and the attack may have briefly reached Rabotino itself. It seems quite likely that Ukrainian troops briefly entered part of the village, but as is now repeatedly happening, the Russians counterattacked and the Ukrainians were pushed out of Rabotino, and the Ukrainians suffered losses. They lost, according to these reports, 3 tanks and 6 armoured vehicles. And in the end, the front lines reverted to the position, the situation that they had been before. I don't think anybody any longer has kept a full count of the number of attacks that Ukraine has launched towards Rabotino. There have been at least a score of them over the course of this offensive. Every one has been unsuccessful. The losses have been appalling, specifically in this area, but Ukraine continues with these attacks because ultimately it is where the main axis of Ukraine's offensive is supposed to be. Ukraine is trying to break through, capture Rabotino, push on towards the Surovikin line, which it has never reached, at least not in this area, in fact not in any area as far as I know, and then break through the Surovikin line. An impossible task, in my opinion, given its density and complexity and all the things we've talked about many times. Anyway, break through the Surovikin line, capture Tokmak, this town to the south, Russian-controlled, itself now heavily fortified. If you look at maps, you'll see that there are belts of fortifications which the Russians have constructed around Tokmak, independent of the Surovikin line itself. They then, if they capture Tokmak, they have to push on to the next important town, in fact, a much more important town, Miletopol, which then is the last big place before the Ukrainians reach the Sea of Azov. And they haven't even managed to capture Rabotino. So far, they've suffered enormous losses trying to capture Rabotino. I mean, all of that is supposed to be the easiest part of the offensive. I suspect that the expectation, the assumption, was that Rabotino would be captured in the first week of the offensive. The Ukrainians have still not captured it. And how they're likely to break through and capture all of those other places, I can't myself understand. And as we will see as we move on with this program, it's clear that it's becoming increasingly difficult for Western commentators to understand that either. Anyway, we then go on to read, and this is still taken from Yevgeny Lizitsin's summary. In the South Donetsk direction, the main battles are taking place in the area of Urozhainoye. This is this village on the Vremivka salient, close to Staromayorsk. Staromayorsk, now in the grey zone, neither the Russian nor Ukrainian troops occupy it. But the Ukrainians have been focusing now on Urozhainoye. The idea is that if they can capture this village, they'll be able to push forward along this small winding road. The Vremivka salient would be essentially captured. Again, a place that Ukraine was probably expecting to capture on the first day of its offensive on the 4th of June, but which it has struggled to capture ever since. Anyway, the idea is that it would then finally reach the Surovikin line in this area, and then there's 15 more villages beyond that, all of them fortified, before it finally, the Ukrainian army were finally to reach Mariupol, which is probably defended also, fortified also, but which, by the way, is in the throes of a major rebuilding program. And of course, if Mariupol were to be recaptured by Ukraine, that would again bring Ukraine to the Sea of Azov. Now, as I've discussed in earlier programs, the Ukrainian troops who are fighting here are drawn from Ukraine's Marine Force, its 4 Marine brigades, elite infantry. All of them are concentrated in this particular area of the battle, and there's been concerns expressed by people like David Axe that the losses that these brigades are suffering as they try to battle through these Russian defenses on the Vremevka ledge might ultimately weaken these brigades to the point that they have to be pulled out of the battlefronts, in which case there are no reserves, there are no marine forces kept in reserve, and that could end up weakening the battlefront in this area too, very significantly. Anyway, this is what Yevgeny Lizitsyn tells us happened over the course of this particular attack, this Ukrainian attack, this Ukrainian attempt to capture Urozhainoye. After Ukrainian troops retreated from the outskirts of the village, so in other words, they were pushed back, the situation has stabilized, but the Ukrainian military is pulling up reserves in this area and probing Russian defenses in small groups. According to them, and I presume this is based on reports from Ukrainian sources, Russian artillery is actively and accurately working out neutralizing all attempts at attacks. And many people have commented about the fact that Russian artillery has become much more accurate over the course of this war, and much more rapid in its responses. There's been articles about this on the RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. The Russians have been much more effective in integrating their surveillance systems, their drones, with their fire control systems for their artillery. They've produced various computerized processing equipment, which is like this Strelets system, which has now been circulated to Russian artillery troops. And of course, the Russians are also increasingly using precision-guided Krasnopol shells, so that's presumably why they're becoming more accurate as well. So it's no longer a case of volumes, which, to be clear, can be very effective in themselves in terms of how the Russian artillery works. It is also a case of the Russian artillery becoming more accurate as well. For the record, I doubt that today, any longer, Ukrainian artillery has any advantage over Russian artillery, either in range or accuracy, despite certain claims to the contrary that you see appearing from time to time in the media in the West. And anyway, to continue with, again, Lizitsyn's summary, there is more news coming from the area of Marinka. Here in the area of the Trudovsky mine, this is a coal mine, Marinka is a coal mining area. Russian troops managed to take control of a powerful Ukrainian fortified position. Positional battles continue in this area. I would repeat again what I said many times. I think for the Russian military, the whole Marinka business has turned into something of an embarrassment. They claim to have captured, or at least some people in Russia claimed that Marinka had been captured way back in October. We're now in August. Ukrainian troops are still holding on in Marinka, but I suspect at very, very heavy cost. And I speculated in the past that it could also be the case that the Russians are doing the same thing in Marinka that they did in Bakhmut and other places, which is, in a sense, allow the Ukrainians to hold on and inflicting very heavy losses upon them in particular locations. And then we go on to read that in the Bakhmut area, this is, of course, the area, another important area where Ukraine has been attacking. In Marinka, it is the Russians who have been attacking, but in Bakhmut, the Bakhmut area, it's been one of the main axes of Ukraine's offensive. Anyway, in the Bakhmut area, the situation in the area of Klesheyevka, the village that Ukraine has been trying to capture for weeks now, has significantly improved for Russian units. After a series of attacks by the armed forces of Ukraine, the main purpose of which was to occupy the dominant heights to the south of Artyomsk, that's the town, which most of the world calls Bakhmut, and which Ukraine, of course, still calls Bakhmut, but which the Russians call Artyomsk. Anyway, after a series of attacks by the armed forces of Ukraine, the main purpose of which was to occupy the dominant heights to the south of Artyomsk, Russian troops counterattacked, throwing the enemy back another kilometer. Now, can I just say that in an interview she gave to The Guardian, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said that Ukraine was in control of the high ground around Bakhmut and was able to shell Russian troops there. Lisitsyn says that in fact the Russians have recaptured the high ground, and in fact I can say that this is certainly the case. It's far from the case that Ukraine controls all of the high ground around the Bakhmut area, and according to Lisitsyn, they've just lost some of the high ground they did control near Klesheyevka. And then Lisitsyn goes on to say, despite this, artillery is working on both sides, and the Ukrainian military have gathered forces and will try again to launch another attack in this same area. And again, I have lost count. I think practically everybody has, of the number of Ukrainian attempts there have been to capture Klesheyevka and the heights both to the west and east of this small village. Like many villages, it lies on low ground with higher ground to the west and east of it, though higher ground in this area should be said, a fairly relative thing. We're not talking about a valley or anything of that kind. So, nonetheless, despite these weeks of attempts to try and capture Klesheyevka, the Ukrainian military has failed to capture Klesheyevka, and nonetheless, Ukraine appears to be trying again, even though they're still stuck in this position. And there's, by the way, a more detailed report of the fighting in the Bakhmut area from someone else, which is also reported on Slavyangrad, and it is a more detailed report about the fighting, and it basically tells us some of the same things that Lisitsyn has described, though with perhaps a little more detail, and it reads as follows. Ukraine has decreased the frequency of assaults on the Bakhmut area due to significant losses in personnel and armoured vehicles. And that, by the way, is also the view of several other people. The fighting in the Bakhmut area is now starting to lose intensity. And anyway, this report goes on to say the Russian army capitalized on the Ukrainian forces' pause and successfully launched a series of counterattacks in various locations around Artyomovsk, that's the former Bakhmut. To the west of Kurdyumovka, this is this village to the south of Artyomovsk, which the Ukrainians have also been trying to capture, without success, by the way. It's a bigger place than Klesheyevka and apparently contains some industrial facilities. Anyway, the Russians have advanced to the west of Kurdyumovka in the direction of Belaya Gora, to the northwest of Klesheyevka in the direction of Ivanivskaya, which is referred to here as Krasnoye. By the way, Ivanivska is an important place. The Russians, the Wagner organization, never managed to capture it. If the Russians ever do go back on the offensive in this area, Ivanivska will undoubtedly be one of the places they will want to capture. If they capture Ivanivska, they can then move further west towards the town of Chasov Yar. Ukrainian soldiers, talking to the British media much earlier in the fighting, whilst the Wagner organization was busy trying to capture Bakhmut itself. Anyway, Ukrainian soldiers, I remember telling the British media that Chasov Yar was essentially undefendable. The topography made defences there all but impossible, and the place was too small to defend properly anyway. So if Chasov Yar is captured by the Russians after Ivanivska, it'd be an easier place to capture, presumably, once Ivanivska itself, which is surrounded by forest belts, making its capture apparently quite difficult. But if Ivanivska is captured, Chasov Yar can be captured, at which point the Russians are able to advance further west towards Konstantinovka, where the Ukrainian headquarters in this area is located. Konstantinovka is a somewhat bigger town. If it is captured, then the way is basically open to advance towards Kramatorsk. So anyway, the Russians have pushed back. They've pushed back Ukrainian troops from Klesheyevka, and they've got closer to Ivanivska again. And the Russians have also made advances north of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, according to this report, to the south place of Berkhovka, another village Ukraine has been trying to capture for weeks, but has failed to do so. Prigozhin claimed that the Ukrainian troops had indeed captured Berkhovka back in June. This is shortly before he began his mutiny. The Guardian still reports that as true, even though there is an abundance of evidence that Berkhovka actually remains firmly under Russian control. Anyway, the Russians have launched an attack to the southwest of Berkhovka in the direction of Bogdanovka, another important village which the Wagner organization failed to capture, but which the Russians would want to capture if they wanted to advance further west. And this report goes on to say several positions have been reclaimed. There is ongoing positional fighting in this area with no major changes in the front line for either side. So, in other words, Ukraine is bogged down in the Bakhmut area as well. And then last but not least, going back to Lysitsyn, he talks about the area where it is the Russians who are advancing. And he says the advance of Russian troops in the Kupiansk direction continues. Russian troops pushed the Ukrainians back from Ivanovka, I'm not sure where this place is, by the way, but anyway, and continued to expand the zone of control in the area of Novozelovsky and Sinkovka. So there you see that he seems to accept that Sinkovka is still under Ukrainian control. In addition, there is a small advance in Petropavlovka and Berestovoye. Again, places I am not familiar with. But the general story seems to be that the Russian troops are continuing their gradual envelopment of Kupiansk. They're preparing the ground for an attack on Kupiansk. Their tactic seems to be to advance gradually on a wide front, stretching Ukrainian defenses and causing the Ukrainians greater losses, and that enables them to push forward and break Ukrainian defenses in that sort of way. So that seems to be the overall situation on the battlefronts. And there has been some more reports now about Ukrainian drone attacks on Crimea, big drone attack, and the Russians have talked about this. But before I discuss that, I'm going to now turn to some of these media pieces that have started to appear in the Western media. And the first was a report that I saw on The Hill. Now, The Hill is an interesting magazine in the sense that it seems to be primarily focused on political events in Washington itself. The Hill is, of course, Capitol Hill, so it's named after Capitol Hill. And one gets the sense that it's the kind of place that people who are involved in the various political battles in Washington, it's one of the magazines that is specifically designed for them and which they read. Now, I've never been to Washington, D.C. myself, so that's a bit of speculation on my part. But judging by its content, its usual content, which is heavily focused, by the way, today on Hunter Biden's legal problems and the fact that special counsel has been appointed to look into them, that I think is a reasonably plausible guess. But anyway, that's, I think, what The Hill is. And if so, then, of course, it's reflecting what I suspect is the mood in Washington, and particularly in Congress, and about the people who work in Congress, the various staffers there. And we read that there is growing alarm about the pace and prospects of Ukraine's counteroffensive, with few signs of progress in recent weeks, and Russian lines holding strong. Those concerns picked up steam in the past week after Ukraine launched a second push in the southern Zaporozhye region, and has still come up mostly empty in the eyes of Western allies. Now, this article was written on the 10th of August, and what it is referring to is the attack by Ukraine's 10th Corps, which took place in the last week of July. So that's actually quite a while back. But if you remember, when that attack by the 10th in the last week of July by the 10th Corps took place, there was an accompanying article in the New York Times which said that this was the start of the big Ukrainian attempt to break through. All the previous attacks on the front lines had been intended to stretch and weaken the Russian front lines. There'd be a major attack it would take 1 to 3 weeks to assess whether it had been successful. Well, we've now passed that 3-week point, and it has not been successful. In fact, it has failed, and we see the concern that despite this attack having taken place, Ukraine has failed to make any progress. And in the words of the Hill, few signs of progress and Russian lines holding strong. And they then talk about the article, they reference the article which I've discussed previously in CNN, in which there was admissions, public admissions for the first time, that the Ukrainian offensive looked like it was failing, and that it's highly unlikely that Ukraine will now achieve a breakthrough. And then it also reports, the Hill also covers another report, another comment by a US official, another one of these anonymous US officials, to NBC News, and there's a direct quote, and it said that there is frustration that they have not used more of the combat power that they have, that the Ukrainians have not used more of their combat power. And here, a very interesting piece of information, because I've discussed in many, many videos the article by George Beebe and Jim Webb, Time magazine, the one which suggested that Ukraine should give up the offensive and go over to the defensive and use the time thereby gained to begin serious negotiations with the Russians. Anyway, here we have the Hill. For the first time that I'm aware of, a publication other than Time magazine has refers to the Beebe Webb article. It goes on to say the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft said in a Time magazine piece that Ukrainian forces are outmanned and outgunned and need a plan B, which would include scaling back to focus on defense. So it looks as if, with the offensive having failed, that article in Time magazine by Beebe and Webb is finally gaining traction. People, I'm guessing, on Capitol Hill are now looking at it and are beginning to think that perhaps this is what Ukraine should do. And we have comments like this, and this is from Senator Tommy Tuberville, Republican, Alabama, and he's a former football coach. Anyway, the Hill quotes him as saying this: he gave voice to this growing skepticism, comparing Ukraine to a junior high team playing against a college team. And he said that in an interview with Fox News. They can't win. And that's an interesting perspective. We've been told for months now, almost a year in fact, that the Russian army is incompetent, inefficient, badly led, corrupt, demoralized, all of those things. I've suggested in various programs that it's more a case of that the real situation is completely different. So have various others, Brian Boletic, Douglas McGregor, others, suggested that the situation is not like that at all. I've even on one occasion, I think, said that if one compares the Russian approach to the war with the Ukrainian one, it's more a case of professionals on the Russian side being matched against amateurs. And isn't that effectively what Senator Turbeville, former football coach, is also saying that the Ukrainians are a junior high team playing against a college team. Anyway, there we go. And then the Hill article says that despite all of the problems Ukraine is having, the Biden administration remains outwardly confident in outright victory, as by the way they did during the Afghanistan debacle, right up to the moment when Kabul fell, just making that point. But anyway, there's clearly growing doubts, and we learned that the offensive in Zaporozhye had big ambitions. Ukrainian forces need to break through miles of territory to the Sea of Azov and several land bridges from mainland Russia to the Crimean Peninsula, and that Ukrainian troops are also trying to advance in Bakhmut, but both offensives face major obstacles of dug-in trenches, minefields, Russian air superiority, and intense artillery defenses. Russian troops are resisting Ukrainian advances, with territory constantly being traded back and forth. And all of this is true. The article does mention Ukrainian demands for F-16 fighter jets. We've just heard that the first training on Ukrainian pilots is going to start, but it's not training in flying these machines. It's in acquiring English language skills necessary to understand the training to fly these machines. And the date by which Ukraine might acquire F-16s has now been pushed back to the summer of 2024. And I discussed in my recent program how the United States, the administration, is now saying that they're going to they're looking for Congress to authorize another $13 billion in military aid for Ukraine. But I've also said that there are increasing shortages in artillery and depletion of supplies, and it's going to be increasingly difficult for the United States to keep up the same level of supplies as previously. The administration continues to talk this up, to talk up the possibility of Ukraine being able to hang on, very much like they did, as I said, over Afghanistan. But I remember, and I think increasingly, that it was in the Financial Times that I read one article which mentioned in passing that on one particular week in the recent fighting, the Russians launched 70,000 rounds of artillery a day. That's over the course of a single week. 500,000 shells. 500,000 shells over the course of the week. 70,000 shells a day. Now, we've also heard that there are no shortages of shells. No sign of shortages of shells on the part of the Russian military. And of course that does again beg further questions about how many shells Russia has in stock and how many it is producing. I can't believe that the Russians are producing the 26 million shells a year that they would need in order to sustain levels of shell expenditure at the level of 70,000 a day. But I'm guessing that they have more than enough, that they're producing more than enough shells, that they can absorb surges in shell use, such as they have to undertake over the course of particular intense battles. And I'm going to throw in one further piece of speculation here. I mentioned a moment ago that the article in The Hill was referencing the attack by Ukraine's 10th Corps on the 25th, 26th, 27th of July, their attempt to break through the Russian defenses, the attempt which was supposed to punch through these weakened defenses, these weakened Russian defense lines, and press on towards the Sea of Azov, and which US officials were saying it would take 3 weeks or so to see how successful that attack had been. I'm going to guess that that period when Russia used 500,000 shells in a single week, 70,000 a day, was when the Russians countered this attack by the 10th Corps in the last week of July. And we know that the effect was devastating. It appears to have been the single biggest defeat the Ukrainian military has experienced over the course of this offensive in that week in July, and we can see why it's triggered this sense of dismay across the West. Anyway, that was The Hill. We've also had an article, even stronger article, in the Washington Post. And the Washington Post article is principally about a darkening mood in Ukraine itself. And this article appeared on the 10th of August, and it says, slow counteroffensive darkens mood in Ukraine. For nearly 18 months, to start Kiev, Ukraine, this nation is worn out. That's the first words of this article. This nation, Ukraine, is worn out. For nearly 18 months, Ukraine has stood against its Russian invaders, rallying support for its troops by embracing last year's battlefield victories in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Kherson region. I've discussed all three of these battlefield victories at exhaustive length, so very astutely has Brian Beletic. I think that, to repeat again briefly, I think that a lot of the problems we see now derive from a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation of what happened over the course of those so-called victories. But then, anyway, to return to the Washington Post article, it then goes on to say, those wins carried beleaguered Ukrainians through a winter of airstrikes on civilian infrastructure and a brutal and symbolic battle for Bakhmut, the eastern city that fell to the Russians in May. Throughout, Ukrainian officials and their Western partners hyped up the coming counteroffensive, one that, buoyed by a flood of new weapons and training, they hoped would turn the tide of the war. But 2 months after Ukraine went on the attack, with little visible progress on the front and a relentless, bloody summer across the country, the narrative of unity and endless perseverance has begun to fray. The number of dead, untold thousands, those are the Washington Post's words, increases daily. Millions are displaced and see no chance of returning home. In every corner of the country, civilians are exhausted from a spate of recent Russian attacks, including strikes on a historic cathedral to Odessa, a residential building in Kryvyi Rog, and a blood transfusion center in Kharkiv region. By the way, the Russians deny attacks on both of those, either on the cathedral or on the residential building in Krivoy Rog, and they have their own stories to tell about the transfusion centre, blood transfusion centre. But I'm not going to discuss that now. And he says, and then the article goes on to say, this week, 2 Russian missiles hit a single block in the eastern town of Pakrovsk. The Russians, by the way, call it Krasnoarmeysk, and this is true. The Russians did attack this particular block, and it goes on to say, where an evacuation train regularly picks up people fleeing frontline areas nearby, killing civilians and emergency workers who rushed to save them. Again, by the way, and just in parenthesis, the Russians claimed that this was also a position used by foreign mercenaries, and that was why they attacked this area. I wasn't there. I haven't any way of confirming who is right about this, but clearly there was this attack, and that is not denied. But then the article, the Washington Post article, says Ukrainians much in need of good news are not getting any. And then the article basically continues with a long litany of testimonies by various people who are interviewed for the article. They're predominantly civilians, all of whom say how difficult the situation in Ukraine is becoming, and it gives a very bleak picture of the overall mood in Ukraine. A very sad picture, actually, of the mood in Ukraine. I should say that Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who we've interviewed several times on the Duran, speaking about the British attitude to this war, has talked about how the British are conducting it as if it was the Second Crimean War. Over the course of the First Crimean War, the one that was fought in the 1850s, the British anti-war MP of that time, yes, Britain did have anti-war MPs in the 1850s, anti-imperialist MP as well, John Bright, made what was one of the most famous speeches made in the British House of Commons in the 19th century, one of the most powerful speeches of that era, one of the most powerful anti-war speeches ever made, in my opinion. Anyway, Bright spoke about the angel of death hovering over the country, he meant Britain, and one being almost able to hear the beating of his wings. Reading this article in the Washington Post with all these very, very sad testimonies, I felt something similar. The angel of death hovering over Ukraine, and Ukrainians feeling the beating of his wings. Reference to the Crimean War now brings me to the British article in the sequence of Western articles that I'm going to discuss in this programme. And this is an article in The Guardian, and it is about Ukraine's strategy of sending drones to attack Russian locations and positions deep inside Russia. And I should say that the event that has provoked this article is another big Ukrainian drone attack on Crimea. Something like 20 drones were used altogether, and the Russians claim that every single one of them was brought down either by air defences or electronic warfare means. And also, as well as that attack on Crimea, another attack by Ukraine sending drones towards Moscow. The Russians again claim that these drones, these minor, small drones, they sort of buzzed through, and they were, again, according to the Russians, I believe there were just 2 of these drones, they were brought down by Russia's air defense systems, making only superficial damage. Anyway, most unusually, The Guardian has published an article which is strongly critical of this Ukrainian drone strategy. And this is what it says. And it's by Andrew Roth, who I should say I believe is actually in Moscow itself. A new campaign of drone strikes has targeted the Russian capital in recent days, as Kiev has demonstrated its ability to hit Moscow and to keep the Kremlin's war in the hearts and minds of the Russian elites and others seeking to ignore the invasion of Ukraine. Video on Friday showed a drone slamming into the ground and exploding near a residential area in the north of the city, as rowers nearby participated in a national competition at the Krylatskoye district. And then we are told about the earlier drone attacks. And then there's a quote by somebody called Samuel Bendet, who had then told is an expert on military drones at the Center for Naval Analyses. And Bendet says Kiev has a strategy to demonstrate Ukrainian capability, and that this is something that they've developed over the last year. And we're then told that the reason behind these attacks and that striking Moscow, supposed to be Russia's most well-defended city and a center of political, economic and social life, is intended to put some pressure on both the Russian government and population, and to show that Ukraine would not leave devastating attacks on its civilians unanswered. And then Bendet is quoted as saying it's a social and cultural response to Russia's attacks on civilian targets. Not a military response, no, a social, cultural response. And we're then told that the Ministry of Defense sources in Kiev said the drone attacks had the twin aims of raising morale at home at a time when successes on the fronts are scarce, and raising a question among the public over whether Putin was able to protect them. And that the raids on Belgorod region that took place earlier basically had the same purpose. And we go on to read that Ukraine's Western partners, once extremely sensitive to the charge that NATO weaponry was being used in attacks on Russian soil, have come to accept that Kiev has the right to use its own resources to try to destabilize Putin's regime. And this, we're told, is coming from the Ukrainians. Now, before I proceed with the really interesting part of this article, can I say that using drone attacks for nothing else than psychology to lift morale at home, but also principally to create alarm and despondency on the part of the other side, comes very close indeed, in my opinion, to acknowledging the truth of what the Russian authorities have been saying about these drone attacks, which is that they are essentially terror attacks, that they have no military purpose. Mr. Bendet talks as much. He says that they have a social, cultural dimension. He doesn't say that they have a military purpose behind them. And we see that these officials in Kiev, who have been speaking to The Guardian, are effectively admitting it as much. These are purely psychological attacks. Terror attacks is what the Russians call them. And to be frank, I can't see, based on this of these explanations that we see in The Guardian that is actually wrong. But anyway, to press on, we now come to the actual effectiveness of these attacks, and this is what The Guardian says. The documented psychological impact so far has been dubious, with polling indicating little shift in the way Russians feel about the war, and anecdotal evidence from psychologists and reports from journalists showing that many Russians have simply decided to ignore the attacks. Society is not worried about drones is not as worried about drones as when they first started hitting Moscow, said a Moscow-based psychologist, Alexander Kichayev. There is some frustration and anger, but it is not overwhelming at all. The pain threshold has been passed, and now people are used to it. According to Kichayev, the issue of drone attacks has slowly become normalized over time. Officials have tried to downplay their effect. The number of injuries from the drone strikes in Russia have been small, especially when compared with the hundreds of deaths caused by Russian missile strikes on civilian targets in Ukraine. In some cases, they entrench views on the war. In other words, the only effect is that they make the Russians angry with Ukraine and harden their feelings about it. And then we have more quotes from Mr. Kichayev. In the beginning, some of my clients living in Rublevka, this is a wealthy district of Moscow, where some of the drones have passed over, and other elite areas, said they were uncomfortable about the drones. They knew the drones flew over their neighborhood, but they have since stopped bringing the topic up. When I talked to them about the drones, I just told them there isn't much they can do to change the situation, and that helps them tackle anxiety. And then the Guardian goes on to say, anecdotal evidence has shown the same. It is also very unlikely that you are there when the drone lands. You just have to continue to live, to work. I think the military is doing well to stop most of them. And that's a quote from Maxim, a business consultant who has worked at Moscow City, where some of the drones have hit. And then we go on to read from The Guardian that even at Vnukovo airport in western Moscow, where air traffic has been regularly halted because of reports of drone activity, officials have grown used to the situation. Not a big deal. Everyone is used to it already, one Vnukovo official said. Russians who have largely shrugged their way through the war despite a large-scale mobilization and growing repressions appear to be unmoved by the occasional Ukrainian strike on the capital. Yes, Ukraine can strike Moscow, everybody knows that now. But so what? The society is not going to change its attitude towards Ukraine at this point, and that's it. We reach the point of no return. That's what I'm trying to understand right now. And that quote is from Mr. Bendet. So, in other words, these strikes, these drone strikes on Moscow are a complete waste of time in military terms, in psychological terms, even as a terror weapon. They are achieving nothing. They're not shaking Russian confidence in the Russian government. If anything, they are hardening Russian opinions against Ukraine. And anybody who's experienced terrorist attacks of any sort, I experienced them in London in the 1970s, and I also, by the way, witnessed them, or witnessed the after effects of them more properly, whilst I was in Moscow in the early 2000s, when Moscow was the target of much more devastating terrorist attacks than anything we're seeing from these drones. Anyway, anybody who has had experience of this would have anticipated that these would be the case. These drone attacks, whatever the effect they may be having on civilian morale in Ukraine, are not denting Russian support for the Russian government, or Russian support for the war in any way at all. They may simply be hardening feelings there. And even on the other purpose of lifting morale at home, which the Guardian speaks about, which apparently these Ukrainian officials have talked about, well, we see from that Washington Post article that that's not working either. Morale in Ukraine is collapsing. The country has become tired. And as I said, a long litany in that Washington Post article. I'm not going to read them. It's behind a paywall of comments by Ukrainian civilians confirming the darkening picture, the darkening morale being, of course, the words that the Washington Post itself chose to use. So, I said a few weeks ago, in fact I said it more than once, that July was going to be a pivotal month. It was going to be the month when it finally sunk home, to some extent in Ukraine, and increasingly in the West, that Ukraine is actually going to lose the war. And we are starting to see now the accumulation of evidence of this. Ukrainians themselves are becoming concerned. There's been some more comments by Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's hardline foreign minister. He says that he anticipates now that there's going to be more and more pressure on Ukraine to try to negotiate. We see defiant statements from Ukrainian officials that their objectives in the war have not changed. They still aim to liberate every millimeter of their territory, and they still talk about Ukraine refusing all negotiations until that happens. But these statements no longer come across as being made from a position of confidence and optimism, even if misplaced optimism. They increasingly sound like they're made from a position of defiance. Anyway, we see these kind of comments coming from Ukraine, but elsewhere in the United States, in the West, we see articles now starting to appear talking about failures on the battlefield, darkening morale, concern in Congress, talk about perhaps we should think about following the advice of Beebe and Webb and getting Ukraine to go on the defensive. And of course, again, defiant comments from the Biden administration when they talked about the fact that Ukraine is not going to see any F-16s till the summer of 2024. There's been comments to the effect that they still expect, the Biden administration still expects the war to continue going on in 2024. Now, these moments of realization that a war is being lost are important, and they can sometimes lead to changes in policy. But all the indications are that the two lead actors on the Ukrainian side and the American side are instead deciding to dig in and double down. I think it is quite likely that as the prospects of a Ukrainian offensive in the autumn and winter evaporate, we might hear more rhetoric about this relaunching the offensive in the autumn and winter, but I don't think anybody realistically believes that's going to happen. it could very well be that we will see some kind of an attempt to try to move over to some kind of defensive strategy. In other words, calling off the offensive, something which in my opinion should have happened weeks ago. In fact, I have argued against launching this offensive at all, but that's, in the past. But anyway, perhaps we will see attempts to call off this offensive now. Perhaps we will see attempts on the part of Ukraine to adjust to a defensive strategy. But I have to say that, wise though that is, it does come with consequences. It would mean telling the American people, telling the public in the West, that this war at this unsustainable rate is going to have to continue indefinitely, and it's going to tell people in Ukraine the same thing. And unless the defensive strategy is accompanied by a diplomatic strategy based on realities, which it is important to stress is what Beebe and Webb also recommended, it is, in my opinion, trying to go to a defensive strategy is probably likely to be unsustainable as well. The Russians are going to be able to bring far greater resources to their offensive when they eventually launch it than Ukraine can ever do. And for Ukraine to admit, even implicitly, that it can't launch offensives anymore, well, we already see the enormous hit that's causing to Ukrainian morale, and it may be very, very difficult to sustain a defensive strategy unless it is accompanied with a diplomatic strategy to try to find a way out. I think there's a very serious risk that the first part of Beebe's and Webb's advice, going on to a defense strategy, might be followed. There doesn't seem to be much choice but to do that. But I see no sign that the second part, going over to a diplomatic strategy, is going to be adopted. And it's important to say that, as Beebe and Webb said, the two don't go together. The one cannot succeed without the other. But what I think is more likely to happen, I'm sorry to say, is that is what we're going to get. I think that the administration doesn't want negotiations at this time. I did a lengthy discussion with Dimitri Simes Jr. I'm going to provide a link under this program which sets it out, in which I discussed the various obstacles, discussed with Dimitri Simes the various obstacles to negotiations. I think the administration does not want to embark on a diplomatic strategy. I don't think Ukraine is able to embark on the diplomatic strategy. And I think they will only follow a part of Beebe's and Webb's advice, go over to a defensive posture, which actually might in the end create more problems than it offers solutions, and might perhaps prolong the war a little, but won't change its outcome in any way. And I suspect now that for the administration, damage limitation is now the end of the game. They no longer believe that victory in Ukraine can be achieved. The entire objective now is to keep the war going until and beyond, if possible, next year's November elections, so that Ukraine doesn't become a particularly difficult issue for the president as he seeks re-election. And of course, this is going to become even more important given the latest announcement that the president's son is now the target of an investigation by special counsel. There's a lot of cynicism I fully share about this investigation. It's been pointed out that the special counsel appointed is the same prosecutor who's been conducting this investigation since 2018 and has failed to take it forward in any effective way. And most people whom I've read, places like National Review, Jonathan Turley, Andrew McCarthy at National Review, Jonathan Turley at his blog Recip Loquitur, they all think that this is purely a exercise in trying to kick this investigation into the long grass. What I'm going to say about it is this: the very fact that special counsel is appointed, even if that is the plan, is more likely to raise the public profile of this investigation and is going to lead to more questions on Capitol Hill and more criticism of the president and more discussions about it. So it may be that the plan is to kick it into the long grass, but the very fact that special counsel has been appointed is simply going to offer more scope for criticism than had been the case previously. And I don't think that this particular strategy, if that is the strategy, is going to work. So the president's political problems are growing, and I think that he's not going to risk a very risky diplomatic strategy over Ukraine, nor is his foreign policy team. I think that their plan instead, such as it is to try to keep this thing going until November, to, in other words, dig in and bed down and hope that nothing really bad happens in Ukraine over the next 15 months until the election is finally out of the way. And that is a disaster. It is a calamity for Ukraine, because it means that Ukraine will be trapped in an unwinnable war in which it loses men, machines, economy, parts of its economy, most likely before long, more of its territory. It looks like there's going to be a Russian attack on Kupiansk probably within days, and Kupiansk looks undefendable, and the area around it will probably be captured as well, and we could be seeing further Russian advances towards Izium and the rest. And war fatigue in Ukraine is probably likely to grow. Probably the Ukrainian government is going to have to undertake more repressive actions to keep that under control. But overall, this is a dismal outcome, and it's not impossible that it will fail, and that, as Michael Vlachos said, instead of the war being prolonged in the way that the president hopes, what we're going to see instead is a collapse. Well, who knows? But it seems to me, all the indications are that that's the plan. It's not even a plan anymore. It's not a plan to win the war. It's a plan to try to avoid losing an election. And already there are bitter comments coming from some people, either in Ukraine or connected to Ukraine. I noticed that Viktor Medvedchuk, the opposition politician, who is now in exile in Russia after he was released from Ukrainian custody in a prisoner swap, he's written an incredibly bitter article in which he says that the only reason why the war is being prolonged at all is because of corruption. He complains that 80% of the funds allocated to Ukraine never reached the country. He quite openly alleges, and I want to stress these are allegations from Medvedchuk, that most of the money remains in the United States, that this is a corrupt operation which benefits certain people in the United States and certain people in Ukraine itself, but that the Ukrainian people are paying the price of it. It's an extraordinarily bitter article. I am sure that Medvedchuk is arranging for it to be circulated in Ukraine itself. Perhaps many people there recently have not been paying much attention to Medvedchuk. But now that we hear that the mood is darkening in Ukraine again, perhaps they will. That Zelensky feels vulnerable in terms of corruption allegations is perhaps highlighted by this crackdown that he's now ordered against corrupt military recruiters who have been press ganging people into the Ukrainian army or taking bribes not to do so. Anyway, that's, so far as I can tell, the plan. Keep this thing spinning along to prevent an embarrassing disaster in Ukraine during the election this year. Perhaps there's something in what Medvedchuk says, that it's all now become an exercise in getting as much money circulating through the system and out of Ukraine and into people's bank balances, as Medvedchuk says. I don't know the details of that, but I'm sure there'll be people who will believe it. But anyway, one way or the other, that looks like the dismal outcome that is now awaiting Ukraine. I can't express again in words how frustrated I am about all of this. Anyway, there'll be more things happening in the world on the 14th of August, in 2 days' time. There's going to be a meeting of the chiefs of staff of the militaries of the ECOWAS countries. It seems to me that a military intervention by these countries in Niger is now all but inevitable. It looks like we're going to have another war before very long in West Africa. Another dismal prospect, in my opinion, however that war goes. But anyway, this is where I end this program today. More from me soon. Let me repeat again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Check out our shop where you can find all the great things, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things, which you can buy and own as well. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again, more from me soon, and have a very good day.